Well, Greg, what a year.
What a year. We're, of course, paid to watch what happens inside this place, but to be honest, even if you weren't, you'd be prepared to pay a price of admission yourself to watch some of the things we've seen unfold this year.
The journey begins with the Prime Minister stepping into scene under pressure. He faces a leadership challenge against an empty chair. He tries to reboot in a budget, struggles on for 6 months, is gone by September, and we've seen the rise of the second Turnbull experiment.
Right, mate, well, as a long-time Canberran, you're going to know better than anyone else that if you go that way along the foreshore of Lake Burley Griffin, you come across a statue, a tribute to Menzies, and you'd have to think if you were putting a tombstone down as Tony Abbott's political memorial, you might just do it at this very spot, his Prince Philip spot.
That's right, RIP PM, the 26th of January 2015. But Greg, like this walk, there is a long walk to get to this moment. Now, Tony Abbott would say himself that this was a bit of an own goal, this moment when he announces that Prince Philip's going to be a knight in the Order of Australia.
Well, I'm really pleased that the Queen has seen fit to award knighthoods in the Order of Australia to Prince Philip.
So at this spot, on the 26th of January, what Tony Abbott does is coalesce all of the concerns that his party and the public have with him. That is, that he's a voice for the past, not the future, that he's got bad judgment, that he makes bad calls.
I have heard, and there will be considerably more consultation around these awards in the future.
So at this very moment that we're talking about, it's supposed to be the off-season for politics, but the phones are ringing on Tony Abbott, the backbench is talking. He obviously hears some of that and seeks to reset and respond. Across that side of the lake, he goes over to the National Press Club to launch his year politically.
You elected us, you elected me to set Australia up for the long term. The Australian people rejected chaos, and we are not going to take them back to that chaos.
So he's trying to press that reset button, and yet within days, within minutes, the MPs are on the phones talking about that speech.
I believe that it is necessary that this is brought to a head and lanced.
If there's dozens, come out dozens.
The drums are beating from places that you wouldn't necessarily expect, Greg. It's out of Queensland where there seems to be some problems for the Prime Minister, a stronghold for him, you would have thought.
He does not have that unequivocal support.
I think most people around the country, unfortunately, have stopped listening to the Prime Minister.
Julie, welcome to Wentworth.
Thank you, Malcolm. Sorry, I'll try to find you in a moment.
We see Julie Bishop make a dash to the eastern suburbs of Sydney, where she holds a function with Malcolm Turnbull. And history now records that there are a lot of conversations happening between Julie Bishop, Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison, all at this point bound by cabinet solidarity.
That's right, and that's the interesting thing about this particular part of the spill motion. There is no challenger.
You should be Prime Minister.
Oh, you're very kind.
Tony has had utter loyalty and consistency from his front bench.
So we get to the Monday morning and there is no challenger. There's a spill of the Prime Minister's position against an empty chair, Greg.
The result is clear. Noes 61, yes 39.
60-40, not really an emphatic vote of confidence against an empty chair.
No, as people point out, this is a contest with the Prime Minister against no one, and 40% of his party room votes against him. That is a massive vote against the Prime Minister, a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister by his own backbench. It's a warning shot, obviously, across his bows.
This has been a very chastening experience, obviously.
Leadership, as they say, is in the gift of the party room, but really the only gift they gave Tony Abbott on that day in February was one of time.
And that was all he was asking for, Greg. We heard over and again in conversations that he had with colleagues, he was saying, just give me 6 months and see if I can turn things around. And from this point, that's what he tries to do. But he has very little that he can actually throw to. And I know I had a conversation with Brian Loughnane in Aussies at Parliament House where he said now everyone had moved on. There were only two things that people in Australia were interested in, baddies and berries, because you will recall there was a health scare about hepatitis B with frozen berries, and the other thing was on terror. And that is where Tony Abbott really throws the switch. He throws the switch from here on to national security because pretty much that's the only shot he has left in his locker.
So if you're going to be tough on terror, if you're going to want to badger baddies, this is the place you'll come to. All roads seem to lead inevitably to the ASIO headquarters, sometimes complete with maps.
That's right. We did see during the course of the year an ever-increasing number of press conferences that the Prime Minister held with national security agencies, with the police, with defence. At one stage he came here though and was given a tour by Duncan Lewis of the areas, the hotspots in Sydney and in Melbourne where they had real concerns, and it was pretty easy for us to see what those suburbs were.
To the west of the city of Sydney.
And there are genuine convictions about taking on terror for obvious reasons, like the Martin Place siege. But politically, it was traditionally seen as a strength for the coalition and safe as far as the contest with Labor's concerned.
That's right. John Howard always used to say you've got to get two things right in national government. National security is one and the economy is the other. Well, the coalition in this instance had gone pretty badly on the economy, so the last shot left in its locker, Greg, was national security, and there was real overreach there.
That's confirmed. We're just crossing over into Syria this time.
They were moving on every front. There were rumours that began to emerge that Tony Abbott wanted to move the number. We already had the second largest commitment of troops in Iraq, but that he wanted to join in the bombing campaign in Syria, making a very different move there from where they knew that they had the permission of a government to where they knew they didn't have the permission of a government. So that was one front that they wanted to move on. They were moving domestically on citizenship laws, on counter-terrorism, on beefing up almost everything that they had at their disposal. And that's where we saw essentially them trying to, as I said, break away from the Labor Party. The Labor Party stayed strongly within the coalition shadow.
And a street value for that would be around $13 million.
Kidding.
And interestingly too, Greg, they were trying to make another case for national security, and that was on drugs, on ice, on the scourge of ice.
Hi, how are you?
And so again, we saw a national ice task force set up, again with the premise of protecting the community.
It's not a state, it's a death cult. Death cult. Death cult dash death cult, or the ISIL death cult. Whatever we want to call it, it is a death cult.
So the language is intensified, so is the symbolism. We're hearing labels like the death cult and also a proliferation of flags with each of these national security statements.
That's right. With every time we see the Prime Minister, he's in a different location surrounded by uniforms, and it began to become almost a counting exercise. The number of flags went from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 in the press conference that we saw inside and outside of Parliament.
I think people will be pleasantly surprised with how much we've been able to do with the budget bottom line in the face of significant headwinds this year.
So, Chris, budgets don't have to be extravagantly successful political exercises, but in 2015 it kind of has to be for Joe Hockey because 2014 had crashed and burned so badly. He steps up to the plate for his second, and it later turns out final budget. Does he deliver the goods, though?
Well, in his mind, he does. It has to repair the damage that's done of 2014. They're not saying that, but that's essentially what's being done in this budget.
I truly believe in my heart that our nation's best days are ahead of us. Yeah. So now is the time for all Australians to get out there and have a go. Yeah.
But the rhetoric has changed completely in the course of a year. Remember, we started with a budget emergency, which meant that we had to slash and burn, we had to find savings. That's all gone now.
She keeps you on the straight now.
Look at what you're doing. You're good.
So, Greg, the budget is meant to be a reboot for the government, but nothing really changes. The polls stay stuck in the doldrums despite the sales pitch.
47% persistently across the major polls. They barely moved at all.
The coalition trails Labor by a significant amount, which translates into a two-party preferred vote of around 54 to 46.
We can't focus on the polls. What we've got to focus on is the job of strengthening the economy.
I think it's hugely important that we focus on the things that matter to everyday Australians.
The distraction of all of this and the commentary that goes around it, that happens from time to time.
Now be silent, resume your seat.
She descended from the sky to touch down for a Liberal Party event and setting back the taxpayer more than $5,000.
The Honourable Bronwyn Bishop.
I can understand why people are interested in this.
Yes.
Apologise to the Australian people who are watching you now.
Well, I think the biggest apology one can make is to repay the money.
I am a notorious public transportophile.
Yeah. With regard to weddings, I'll be repaying any of those costs associated with colleagues' weddings. I think she should resign.
Today, Ms Bishop called me to let me know that she would be resigning to the Governor-General.
Does the member accept the nomination?
I accept.
So the Senate, 76 of the nation's finest, and this is where the magic happens.
Yeah, according to Tony Abbott, this is where the black magic happens.
It's the party of dirty deals done dirt cheap.
I won't sit down. If you want to come outside, I'll come outside.
So, order.
Hey,
order.
Buffhead. Bloody
order. Senator Heffernan.
There have been moments of controversy. There have been moments of invective.
So the Red Room, as it's known affectionately by many, is actually the epicentre of a lot of government woes. Much of the budget that we've already spoken about from 2014 is still languishing here in the Senate.
And some of the government's woes you would have thought were avoidable because we go back to the change of government. We always knew there were going to be a lot of minor parties coming in. They had 6 months to get ready for them. There were great difficulties there, but the government never seemed to handle the Senate really very well at all. And Tony Abbott in particular never seemed to get a handle on the Senate.
There was a lot that wasn't happening, but there was some change, if not within the government and its tactics, within the Senate more generally, because the Greens this year decided to turn over leader in an organised fashion.
Christine Milne orchestrated it. It was done in complete secrecy, and essentially they just held a press conference at the end saying it was a fait accompli.
Richard Di Natale has been elected unopposed as the Australian Greens leader.
Richard Di Natale is trying to make himself out as a bit of a negotiator, and he gets some early results there on a bill with Scott Morrison, for instance.
That's right, and we're seeing a change in the way that Greens are doing business up here. They are being prepared to deal on some things.
I'm in this business, right, to get outcomes. I just want to get stuff done.
Now, looking at the government benches here, you've got the National senators and the Liberal ones, and an issue is starting to brew this year. When is the coalition going to have the much promised conversation about gay marriage? Well, that comes in the dying weeks, as it turns out, of Tony Abbott's prime ministership, and what a night that was.
It certainly was. We ended up seeing a 6-hour party room debate on gay marriage.
Last night, Tony Abbott made sure the Nationals were led to the policy-making altar.
I think it was a great test of the Liberal Party.
Because it ended any chance of changing the government's solemn vows from the last election.
Roughly 60 backbenchers spoke, roughly 30 front benches spoke.
But this loomed as a contest between the Conservative and the Liberal elements of the parties, and what we saw then was a fracturing of relationships as well.
There's a lot of competing agendas, and they've probably held the longest party room meeting since the one they held on climate change when Malcolm Turnbull lost his leadership of the Liberal Party. Many are heard out. Different agendas which go to plebiscites, the issuing of a free vote, and in the end everyone walks away a winner, it seems, and yet no one is completely satisfied.
And a lot of anger.
I accept that there is some disappointment. We have supported the traditional position
I think that's a good thing, but there is the prospect of change.
We would simply open a Pandora's box if we were to do away with that definition and say that marriage can mean whatever it wants.
Like what possibilities?
Polyamory, clearly. Polyamory is one of those.
It will mean that this issue is a live issue all the way up to the next election, and indeed at the next election.
And one of the people who clearly was greatly angered at that stage and is a dangerous enemy was Christopher Pyne. I think that's the point at which Christopher Pyne mentally breaks away from the Prime Minister and begins to work actively for a change of government.
The Prime Minister is making sure that we have a respectful and sensible debate about all issues.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. President.
So the Senate, not often in the spotlight in Australian politics, but it does have a very important constitutional role to play. And in all of these leadership changes that we've seen, there's always been someone in this House, and in this case it's Arthur Sinodinos, who is working as an agent of change.
I'm not going to play Canberra games.
Everybody knows where I stand supporting the Prime Minister. I've got no idea what others are up to, and that's up to them.
Well, mate, it's the 14th of September. It's a Monday and it's a sitting day. We're walking in Malcolm Turnbull's footsteps as he left after question time, a visit to the Prime Minister's office, and he's come out here into the Senate courtyard to break a pretty significant announcement to the nation.
Absolutely, and that is that he has been to see the Prime Minister and that he is challenging for the leadership of the Liberal Party. But like all the journeys we've been on so far, there is a backstory to this. So let's rewind to the night before, and all of the major news organisations are saying that there is a leadership push on, but no one's actually being definitive about what time that might be. There's a lot of chatter the night before. We know that out at Queanbeyan, at Peter Hendy's house, there is a meeting of the conspirators, which includes Malcolm Turnbull and a whole group of other people. But by the time you hit the morning, the chatter goes quiet, so there's nervousness about the House as this day begins.
The public don't like this insider gossip.
There's a lot of anonymous gossip around at the moment.
Coming out of question time is followed by Malcolm Turnbull.
To this point where we stand in the Senate courtyard, and Malcolm Turnbull makes the case for his Prime Ministership.
A little while ago, I met with the Prime Minister and advised him that I would be challenging him for the leadership of the Liberal Party. The Prime Minister has not been capable of providing the economic leadership our nation needs.
There's a period of time, we're broadcasting, as are most networks by this point in the afternoon, where it's uncertain what the Prime Minister will do in response to this challenge. Will he call a Liberal Party room meeting for that night? How many members are in Canberra at the moment? A state of confusion that persisted for several hours.
It took the Prime Minister more than 2 hours to respond.
This country needs strong and stable government, and that means avoiding at all costs Labor's revolving door Prime Ministership.
Now, at around this point, some numbers are starting to be put into the public realm about just what sort of commanding lead Malcolm Turnbull might hold, and by the time the night ended, it proves that they were pretty close to the mark and that the precision of their numbers marshalling had been fairly masterful.
She looks crushed. Malcolm Turnbull was successful on 54. Tony Abbott, 44.
It was, and there was a fair bit of organisation that went into this, and it's just beginning to dawn at the end of the year on the outgoing Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, just how much organisation there was, really going back to that February challenge that we saw. But certainly one of the captains of this move was Arthur Sinodinos. Arthur Sinodinos, Scott Ryan from Victoria, other people who are putting the numbers together. We know Malbrough and White, Roy in Queensland are doing it for him. And they're coming with a figure of around about 54, 55 votes. Now, of course, the Prime Minister's office is saying that's not the case. But we do know that on the way into that room on that night, Tony Abbott said to one of the people with him, I don't think I've got the numbers.
The burden of leadership is a very heavy one.
The result is announced, Australia gets its 29th Prime Minister, and he duly holds a media conference back where Tony Abbott had been earlier in the night, and it's an entirely upbeat and stark contrast to the preceding government.
As will be everything after this, because one of the things that Malcolm Turnbull's obviously done is had a long, hard look at the Abbott era of governing and decided that he's going to be a different kind of Prime Minister. Whether or not that's successful, as they say in the classics, time will tell.
The boy up, and this way, Julie. Malcolm, me.
And he walks out of that media conference into the waiting arms of two powerful women, his wife, Lucy Turnbull, but on hand also, in a magic moment, is Julie Bishop, the great survivor as a Liberal deputy under so many leaders.
Well, you go back to 2007 and the change of government, John Howard falls, and in comes Brendan Nelson and his deputy, Julie Bishop. Julie Bishop has survived every single change of leader, and she's been instrumental in this. That move that she makes earlier in the day when she goes to see the Prime Minister is the point at which, I think, people around the building knew that the gig was up, really, for Tony Abbott. Julie Bishop is a powerful figure within this party now. She commands the respect of all of the people in the West, and she carries great numbers and great weight with her.
It's not an easy role being the deputy of the party, because often you are seized of information that the leader doesn't want to hear.
So, Chris, one of the most famous driveways in this city, Dunrussell Drive, leads to the gates of Government House, which have swung open, some might say, far too often in recent history to Prime Ministers, and they did for Malcolm Turnbull. Yeah, but been a fair bit of drama come down this driveway over the course of a great many years, of course. Malcolm Turnbull makes the drive to become the 29th Prime Minister of Australia after that late-night press conference where he simply made the transition.
Congratulations, Prime Minister.
We haven't yet heard from the outgoing Prime Minister.
And when Tony Abbott does emerge, he does promise not to be a wrecker, drawing a contrast to others who've suffered that fate.
My pledge today is to make this change as easy as I can. There'll be no wrecking, no undermining, and no sniping.
Making it quite clear that he's very angry about what's happened, and there was a lot of commentary about the fact that it took him quite some time to come out, and when he did come out, he laid some of the blame at the feet of the media, and of course didn't believe that that treachery, as he saw it, and he didn't put it in quite those words, should be rewarded in this way.
I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We get to a point here where Malcolm Turnbull has a few awkward days where he has an old cabinet sitting behind him while he tries to construct a new one. And we see some, I think, very awkward moments for Joe Hockey in Parliament as he has to stay on as Treasurer for a few days.
I am continuing to do my job to the best of my ability.
He is able to remake his ministry in his own image. He's promised agility, he's promised modernity, he's promised equality in some ways, and he tries to deliver that in his new front bench.
Today I'm announcing a 21st century government.
When we see the pictures here on the day that his cabinet is sworn in, a very different looking cabinet, a younger looking cabinet and more female. So this remade new look government comes back a little while later and starts to sit in the Parliament and to face the questions from the Labor Party. How does it try to get a fix on this new government? And that's the problem, isn't it, Greg? They're trying to find the line and length of a new Prime Minister. Now, they had always expected that they might well face Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister. I think it possibly was the worst fear of some of the people in the Shorten opposition, because this is a much different proposition of a man. So they try on a few different things. They go immediately to his wealth.
A new campaign on the politics of envy. This trying to whip up a class war.
And then they tried to get the things that he's not doing. Labor's trying to come in on what's the difference sort of argument as well. And there was no difference. The climate change policy was exactly the same as Tony Abbott's. It was a climate change policy that Malcolm Turnbull had ridiculed. On gay marriage, we know he had a very different position to Tony Abbott on that, not wanting a plebiscite. And for each line of questioning that was opened up, they seemed to close off in very short order. One reason for that, were the polls. They were getting a read on Malcolm Turnbull emphatically and a lot earlier than Labor took to work him out.
A news poll bounce for the new Prime Minister.
And this, I guess, is where we land towards the end of this year, is that there seems to have been from the community this tremendous breath out after the Abbott government was toppled. And I don't think that was just because of what they saw as the negative 2 years of Tony Abbott in power. I think people have made this connection that they might be seeing the end of an era, and that is the Rudd, Gillard, Abbott era of politics, which was particularly bitter, where we saw this turnover of prime ministers and where the politics was brutal and very unattractive, to this new age, as we've seen, as the Prime Minister says, Greg, there's never been a better time to be alive and be Australian. There's a very different message to the death cult is coming to get you. So Greg, Bill Shorten, Leader of the Opposition, his fortunes wax and wane this year as we have the change of leadership. It seemed to me that for a long time they had a plan A, and that plan A was that Tony Abbott was unelectable and they were going to cant it to the next election. They would argue with that, but they seemed to be at sea when they were faced with a new leader.
And that strategy looked outrageously successful without much cost. They really didn't have to do much. Labor didn't have to have too many hard arguments while ever they were so comfortably ahead.
There are important truths we must face.
They also move off to the ALP conference, Bill Shorten's first as a Labor leader. They did manage to bed down some policy platform there, particularly difficult stuff around stopping the boats and maintaining coalition policy effectively if they did form government. That's probably where Bill Shorten started to look reasonably strong.
Advance Australia fair. Thank you very much.
Particularly when it came to boats, Bill Shorten seemed to be doing very well, but there are transactional costs in that. He does need to get the support of the CFMEU, a left-wing union, in order to get him across the line.
That has issues as well around the Trade Union Royal Commission, which is delving into the very nature of Labor's relationship with the unions. Bill Shorten is put through a very tough, a gruelling couple of days in the witness stand there.
Do you accept it would be a serious conflict of interest?
Well, what your question doesn't do is it doesn't go towards what a company would be paying for services for.
Are you evading my question?
No.
A lot of your answers are non-responsive. Some of your answers are responsive, but then add something that isn't responsive. What I'm concerned about more is your credibility as a witness.
And just when it's starting to look like a trouble spot,
a complete gift from Dyson Hayden, who's the Royal Commissioner, that he would agree to go along to a Liberal Party fundraiser. It becomes public, it's printed in the Fairfax media, it's picked up by everyone, gives the Labor Party the opening that they had been so desperately wanting on this, to make the Royal Commission look like a political exercise.
He is conflicted, he is biased, the Royal Commission is a farce.
If members opposite want to debate the Royal Commission, let's bring it on. Let's bring it on.
So Greg, Malcolm Turnbull had a very long honeymoon, but the wheels began to wobble a little bit towards the end of the year.
Because the opposition began to reach back to that particularly murky part of the murky 43rd Parliament, which was the pursuit of Peter Slipper, the Speaker. And Mal Brough, as we know, was deeply implicated in that. He goes on to become Malcolm Turnbull's hand-picked Special Minister of State. But how deeply he was involved is, of course, a matter that the police want to try and find out.
Isn't it time the Minister resigned?
And as they do that, Mal Brough's finally decided to step aside. But the only way he can come back is if the police decide he's got nothing to answer for. If that sounds unsettling, though, what about the first fully fledged ministerial casualty of the Turnbull government?
I've concluded that this behaviour has not met the particularly high standards for ministers. Therefore, the proper course of action for me is to resign.
And as the ministry turns the corner into 2016, expenditure review, razor gang exercises already underway to form up a budget that's very important because it's an election year, but very challenging because there's no money.
That's right, you have the pull of the election year wanting you to spend money to make friends in election year, but the reality of the budget is that they actually have to try and make savings. So pulling off that will be difficult.
Dare I say it, an exciting 2016.
And that's why in 2016, the Australian people, every one of them who's a registered voter, will get to pass judgment on the fairly amazing events of 2015.
Well, Greg, 2016 looms. Let's wait and see if we have the same Prime Minister at the end of it. Good call.